Yes. Boom.
Are they new headphones, Tracy?
They are new headphones. Thanks.
They're
You should have told us about this. You should have done a post about it, really.
Yeah.
Look how much more pink they are than the other ones.
Yes, they're nice. In fact, I think Tim should treat himself to a pair of those.
I'm thinking I was looking at them very
enviously.
And yes,
but match your shirt.
They would. Though it's orange.
Yeah.
Well, it's almost pink, isn't it? Anyway, welcome everybody to this week's edition of the Digital Download, which is, Rob,
the longest running weekly business talk show on LinkedIn Live.
Thank you so much. And we're very lucky today to have a special guest, Giles O'Halloran, who is, we'll let him introduce himself in a moment. All you need to know is that he is the world authority on digital and social HR. We've done some work with him in the past, and we are in awe of his capabilities in this area. But before we bring Giles in, let's go round the horn and introduce ourselves. So, Alex.
Good afternoon, good morning all. Alex Abbott, founder of Sapiro and, wait for it Tracy, exultant partner of DLA Ignite.
Rob.
Hi all, Rob Durant, founder of Flywheel Results, based just outside of Boston, Massachusetts. And I am a proud DLA Ignite partner.
Tracy.
Hello, everyone. I am Tracy Borison, founder of TLB Coaching and Events, where we care about sales and marketing because we care about sales and marketing people. And I am the coolest DLA Ignite partner.
I think there's little doubt about that today. Tim.
Hello, everybody. I'm Tim Hughes. I'm the CEO and co-founder of DLA Ignite.
And everybody, I'm Adam Gray. I'm Tim's business partner and co-founder of DLA Ignite. Now, without further ado, let's bring in Giles O'Halloran.
Hey!
Giles, introduce yourself, my friend.
Thank you very much. And I must say, Adam, thank you very much for setting the bar so high I'm going to bang my head. But I appreciate the very kind and warm welcome in terms of my social media and my social HR background. I don't consider myself the true lead. I do consider myself, as I said previously, I'm not an expert, I'm an enthusiast because things are changing so quickly. But obviously, for anyone who's on the call and say hello to everyone, my name is Giles O'Halloran. I am an HR professional. Please don't hold it against me. So I am a dark sider, to put it bluntly. As for that, in terms of my background, I run a small company, which is a freelance HR capability. We focus on 4 T's really. So training, so developing HR professionals to the next stage. We're talking about also talent, so helping organizations understand what talent is, because it's very different organizations, different departments and functions, and what does that look like? What are the frameworks you can put in place? Also T for technology, so helping in particular HR and business understand and adopt technologies, especially in things like the social space, where we can use things like recruitment, etc. And then finally, T for transition. Things are changing in our world. So one of the areas I've looked after for 20 years is helping people understand the impact of things like a good resume, a good CV, LinkedIn profile, how you connect the dots in between them. So those are the 4 T's. And the nature of my work has taken me globally in terms of what I do, both virtually and physically. So I've worked in the Far East, Middle East, Africa, Europe. I'm afraid I haven't gone too far west just yet. We will see. But other than that, the work I've delivered is mainly around HR development, future of HR, future HR practices, and business partnering is my speciality. So there you go. I can breathe.
Indeed you can. So welcome, as always. And I'm sure that the audience have got lots of questions and insights that they'd like to get, and certainly we'll have loads of questions for you. So I'll kick it off, if I may. Obviously, digital has had an impact on everything that we do from a work perspective, and it's no doubt had an impact on hiring as well. Now people don't rely on 2 sheets of A4 paper to decide whether or not you're the right person to interview. They can look at your social profile or social profiles and they can see not only how you present yourself, but they can look at your history. They can see what others say about you. They can see how you behave and how you interact with people, whether what you say and do is appropriate or inappropriate. So it gives surely much deeper insights for hiring managers and people that are looking to headhunt talent into their organization. And I'm sure that that's a great plus side. But what's the downside to that? Because clearly it's not as straightforward as simply I make myself look good and then you give me a great job.
Exactly that. I think there are some, as a whole, in terms of technology, HR and the recruiting world is evolving, very quickly in terms of ATS's applicant tracking system, HRMS, the human resources management systems, and there are multiple sort of layers and capabilities out there, which is all good. But as you rightly say, people who have a social media profile, how do they connect that dot to the ATS? Do ATS understand? Can you transition that information across? Are things like, for instance, certain language elements included? Because an ATS might then qualify an individual according to, say, SME, which could stand for subject matter expert, or it could be small medium enterprise, which case it has to be configured effectively. But on the back of that, as you rightly say, there are some big risks around potential discrimination and intrusion. So if individuals, how far do they go, recruiters, in terms of looking at your social profile? Is it appropriate? Are they making judgments that may be deemed as illegal in some countries, potentially discriminatory, because you're making a judgment purely on data rather than actually talking to the person and balancing it? So I think there are some massive risks about that, and that leads to potential profiling. Are you recruiting more of the same? Could you be discriminating? Are you really being diverse and inclusive in the way you look at things? So I think that could be really quite an interesting space to sort of progress in. And I think there are some massive opportunities in the technology side as much as risks. And again, we have to be careful of things like fraudulent stuff. People might embellish their CV or their details. How far does that go? Because that can be deemed as fraud if they actually get a job as a result of it. So there's so much. I think it's a really big minefield in that respect.
But surely from the hirer's perspective rather than the hiree's perspective, it's easier to do due diligence on somebody's level of expertise and their history. I mean, I always thought, you said about lying on your CV, I always thought that was part of the game. It's a tapestry of lies. I tell you, the hiring manager, what I think you want to hear, and then you hire me. Isn't that how it used to work?
Well, you lied about me being the world expert about social HR, so there you go. You
prime example.
Rolling well. So, case in point, my friend. But no, I think this is where there's a difference between polishing and embellishing. Polishing the content to make sure it's relevant, pertinent, that people catch it. I mean, I do say that that the time has really reduced over time. People's attention spans dropped, especially over the last 2 decades, more with technology, and also because things like Google, people expect that answer now. I want that response, and people only take 8 seconds maybe to look at a CV and what's on it and whether that actually is pertinent stuff. So people have therefore trained their mind and their way of working to pick out pertinent points to make it attractive. But how far that goes is another matter. Now, yes, you can dig into the data, but more often than not, more people are integrating their online with their CV, etc., to make sure there's that consistent message, which is great because you've got to make a pervasive professional profile. The P's there. But I think the worry there in terms of digging a bit deeper, unless you've got some form of due diligence that you can do legally and that you're open about it as well, to say that, for instance, whenever I've done recruitment with organizations and we have used social media, I've advised them that as part of the recruitment process, advise people that we will be looking at your social media profiles and public profiles in order to understand more about the candidates that we are bringing in, so that you're open and transparent, because otherwise you could be deemed as, you could be discriminatory, or your practices, or you could be making decisions around people that are inappropriate in some cultures.
Wow. Yes. I guess that makes perfect sense. And, I think that one of the things is, as we kind of move out of the old-fashioned way of, you do as I say rather than I do, into a more kind of, we hope, open and equal society in a way of doing things. We do need to be mindful of how we treat people in every interaction that we have with them. So yeah, I think that's really valuable. So now from the candidate's perspective, because previously on this show we have occasionally touched on what people can do with their social profiles in order to make themselves more visible, in order to mobilize their network so they can get introductions into job opportunities, or even to perhaps become aware of job opportunities that are not yet in the public domain. So obviously, if I'm able to mobilize my network, Tim is in my network, he works at company X, I'd like a job at company X, I strike up a conversation with Tim and he makes an introduction for me, that's fine, because I've gone through the relationship route, and that we understand how to mobilize, as you know. But if I'm trying to go through the recruitment consultant route, what sorts of things should I be mindful of in terms of how I present myself online? And what are the risks? Because one of the things that we see is that, generally speaking, people can have one kind of profile or the other. They have a profile which enables them to do what it is they're supposed to be doing. So if I'm in a sales role, the last thing I need to say on my profile is that I'm a salesman, because clearly that makes it very difficult for me to do my job. If, however, I'm looking to get a new job somewhere, if I don't have the word salesman on my profile, the hirer won't know that I'm a salesman, because you can't expect them to read and read between the lines. So how do I strike the balance that I'm still able to be productive in my role in sales, let's say, but also be attractive to recruitment consultants where they can introduce me into their clients?
So I think you've layered 2 or 3 questions into that narrative.
Hopefully.
So what are they? Just for clarity in terms of, the first thing I think is, how do you make yourself attractive as a candidate to recruiters is the first one. Is that
yeah.
So I think that goes back to the first thing is make sure that you, as you rightly say, you've got to be mindful of language, current themes, etc., that people are looking for. If there are certain job specs, etc. One of the things you can do as a candidate, particularly on LinkedIn. LinkedIn is probably the best tool to use for anything around recruitment, because everyone goes there; it becomes gravity. But things like, you can save jobs on your profile, which case you could look at, and that then gives you an indicator of the kind of things that might come through. It gives you an algorithm behind the scenes that says, if you like this, you're going to like this. And so the more you save, even if you don't apply, it gives the indicator comes up. And what you can do is start to look at those job specs and go, what's the language being used? What are the key hashtags, things that I can use on my profile as well, that I can use in conversations? And what kind of conversation am I getting involved with? Which groups am I in? What kind of things am I posting? What hashtags am I using so that I can be found? And even on LinkedIn, you can find those different hashtags where there are key conversations around, where you can then align your things to it and say, right, this is what I'm going to. So you get seen. So there are lots of different routes. I think it goes back to one of the big ones to consider with anything around recruitment these days, and especially with networks, and LinkedIn proves this point, is there was a paper written back in, I think it was 1974, by a socialist sociologist called Granovetter. Could have been a socialist, you never know. It was the time. It was quite fashionable then, but back in the 70s then, Granovetter wrote, he was a sociologist, he wrote the strength of weak ties. And in that paper, he proved that 60 to 70% of all jobs then were found through networks, not through friends, direct, that one first connection, but friends of friends, acquaintances, the second connection, which is the power of LinkedIn. And so that's been something that we've known for a number of years. And I think the tools out there now have improved upon that. LinkedIn has improved that and pushed those numbers up, potentially 70 to 80%, maybe higher in some fields. But when it comes to advising candidates the way to use networks more effectively in order to engage with recruiters, whether they're in-house recruiters or whether agencies, I use 4 N's to get people to think. Firstly is Nexus. Nexus is the center point. What is it that's unique about you? What are your USPs if we speak sales speak? What are your USPs that you bring to the party that you can say, that's me, that's what I'm respected for, these are my capabilities, and that I can shine a light on? That's the first N. The next N is about being a node. So that's being about that connection that shares, that engages, that is an active around you, because you cannot expect others to do what you won't do for them. And so this is the power of the network, that shared mindset. The next thing is about network. It's about leveraging both the nexus and the node elements across your network, making sure there's constant engagement, sharing, even just liking things that come up and think, actually, that's interesting, or sending someone a birthday, happy birthday, posting stuff, congratulations on your role. You're keeping that alive. But those 3 N's are then underpinned by another N, which is netiquette. You've got to, as you rightly say, behave professionally and online in order to be seen as the people that want to engage with you. And I think that would be my simple response as a framework.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I mean, I do think that LinkedIn is simultaneously, and I haven't applied for a job for years, many years. Clearly. But LinkedIn it appears to me to be simultaneously the candidate's best and worst friend from a recruitment perspective. Pretty much every job that's in the public domain is going to be listed somewhere on LinkedIn. Somebody is going to be hiring and posting about that. There will be job postings on the job boards and job adverts on there. And the LinkedIn Recruiter tool will showcase to me those things that seem to dovetail with my skills or the skills that I say I have. So I get that, and from my perspective as somebody that's been laid off, and we've had a number of kind of sessions over the last 18 months where we've spoken about how can we help you, the audience, if you've been laid off and you're finding it difficult to get interviews and whatever. So as a candidate that's been laid off, I'm looking to touch as many job opportunities as I possibly can and see which one seems to find me attractive in order that I can walk towards that. But I can apply with a single click. And the problem with that is that I can load up 50 different jobs and go click, 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 click. And if I can do it, you can do it. And Alex can do it, and Tim can do it, and Tracy can do it, and Rob can do it. And the problem is that the poor hiring manager's now got 500 people applying in the first 10 minutes of this. And how do I stand out? Sorry, Tim, you were going to...
I was going to say what Rob always jokes is that even as a candidate, we can go apply. On the back of that, the hiring manager's going reject.
Yeah, the lazy apply.
It is, and that's where I've actually been through this myself recently. So a client I was working with, I did a piece of work for them to understand more about. I actually went in there first to identify what was their HR need, because they're a growing organisation from SME upwards, and they said we don't have an HR person. And I think rightly so, they said, look, instead of getting to 800 plus people and going, oh, we need an HR person, do we need to bring someone in now and scale it up in order to make sure it works? I think there's the right way of doing it. So we talked about what that looks like. As a result of that, they offered me either to do the work for them, which I don't have the time and the capability at the moment in order to deliver what they require. But they then said, well, can you help us recruit someone? And I said, well, you could go to a recruitment consultant, we can help you write the spec. Well, so no, we trust you. Can you do it for us? And I thought, well, I like the people, I like the company, yeah, I'll do it. So I then recruited for this HR manager for them. And I know myself going through it that you will get, I got 100 applicants within 3 days. And some of them, and I think LinkedIn as a tool did it pretty well. They, as long as you feed the information, these are things you need to tick that it will sift some of it for you. And a lot of systems are doing that already. We've been doing it for a number of years to sort of qualify candidates. But again, it's the machine looking at what does it think it's looking for. And therefore we have to be mindful of bias as well in terms of what might be programmed into machines. But in the same light, it did help me then identify and go down to say, out of those 100 candidates I got within 3 days, there were 60 that were relevant that I could then go, right, there are 20 that I'm going to interview. But I could qualify them quickly from downloadable CVs and look through it. So I found it very, very useful as a tool to quicken things. What I found time consuming, but I still did anyway, because it was the ethical thing to do, was to write back to every every candidate that didn't make the assessment and say, this is why, or, haven't been successful this time because of this. That's the bit that takes time, because you have to you can't just go blank, but you can do blank, but I think it's impersonal and it destroys your potential brand as an employer. It was about actually taking time to respond to each individual saying, you haven't been successful because these are where your skills lie, fall down, etc. versus other candidates. And then briefing the 20 that I took through, and then briefing those we went down to about 5 or 6 that went through to the final sort of stages. But I try to engage at every level. And my feedback, though, I must say, my feedback from candidates has been really positive, which I'm glad, because I treat people as I'd like to be treated myself. I think it's just good karma. But that's the bit, I think, as a recruiter, as an ex-recruitment consultant, that's how I started life. Many years ago after graduating, I was a recruitment consultant. And I find it frustrating sometimes that I had 200 or so candidates on my books. You can't keep up to date with them all the time, even though you'd like to. And sometimes you feel a bit like a social worker in sometimes with too much casework, and you don't have the time to sort of do it. And people have very unique circumstances. Some people might be going through very, different relationship problems. They might be potentially losing the house because they lost their job. And so sometimes you're there to help them otherwise. And I think that blend of being human, that's where we add value in that process, is we can use these machines. We can be mindful of how quickly it can apply. but sometimes you've got to put a bit of time and effort in to make it human. I think, yes, it is easy to get all these applications, and yes, it is easy to go, you reject, but it doesn't reflect on your brand, because I bet any candidate you speak to will turn around and go, I didn't hear back from that. I never heard anything. I don't know anything. And what we've done is completely dehumanize what is realistically a human relationship. And I think that damages your brand. That damages the way you work things. You're relying on a machine and not the person. And I think you lose that connection then, which you're trying to generally make by that word social, because that's about people, not machines. And I think we lose sight sometimes then if we don't put a bit of genuine human authenticity into the way we recruit and what we do.
And does that is that on both sides of the scale? Because as you know, Giles, because we've worked together, we drive people that we train to be very personal in terms of how they talk about themselves and their journey to get to where they are. And, on the basis that you are the best thing that you have to offer, that's what you need to lead with. And yes, if you are going to become my surgeon, I need to know that you know how to operate a scalpel. Clearly, that's a given. But beyond that, surely that personal element, you seem like the sort of person I would like to work with, is more powerful than the fact that I've been doing this for 15 years and Tim's been doing it for 16, therefore he must be better than me. Because lots of those things that we see time and again in people's profiles actually don't prove success or competency. They only prove that people have filled in a template, basically.
And I think you're right to highlight that. It goes down to this magic word, trust. And that's the bit that really comes to the fore here. I can't remember that. He was the previous editor of Wired. He's written a number of books. He's written Free, Maker. I can't remember the name. I've got to that age now. Forgot. I go to the toilet and forgot what I've gone there for. But sorry?
What age? What were you talking about?
You'll get there.
I'll go to the toilet and forgot what I've gone there for. So it's what I was going to say on that note. I can't remember. And he's brilliant. He reads some really good stuff. But what I liked about, he was talking about social networks and the way to recruit and the way people are working now. He said that fundamentally in the modern world, there are two things that are your currency, and that comes to employment. Otherwise, it's trust and credibility. Can people trust you, and are you credible? And therefore, the credibility, and that's been proven in second connections on LinkedIn. Are they willing to reach out? Well, actually, I know there are connections to that person. I trust them. And actually, looking at this profile, they look credible. But do we trust in that individual, what they are? And that's what we need to look at, going a bit deeper, understanding some of the mistakes around trust. So Maester and Green wrote a book a number of years ago called The Trusted Advisor. One of the things they highlighted was the exact point there is about people connect and trust people based on their experiences and the way they do things. And the simple way I describe trust, it's taken from someone else, it's completely robbed. But I think it's true, and that is that trust is the willingness to be vulnerable to someone. That's what it comes down to. And we'll all be willing to be vulnerable to a certain extent, depending on our experiences and what we've got. And when it comes to one of the 5 mistakes that Maester and Green highlighted, it was trusting in the technical. And that is, it was a really interesting piece of research, I believe, that was done with pediatricians. And a number of families were asked, which pediatrician would you go to? There's a set of pediatricians, and you had the least experience and the most experience with all qualifications, certifications, etc. behind it. But what they found was that the families did not choose purely based on the qualifications. They chose on which one connected with their child. Mm. And that's important. That's human. That's very much. It goes back to what we're talking. It's about storytelling. We have something in our brain that that goes back to very much in terms of our evolution about stories and narratives and what have you. We connect with a story. It helps us do so. And no disrespect to anyone on this call in terms of your background, your thoughts on faith and belief, but every faith system in this world is based on a story, and therefore we connect with that, and that gives us a sense of belief. And it's that story, that connection, that trust that I think we can't afford to lose with technology. And that's why I'm a strong believer that the future work and where we're going is not simply binary. It's not just simply human or machine. It is a combination of the two. It's about blending technology and talent. You shouldn't lose or dilute the difference and opportunity with both.
Okay, I have somewhere a question I'd like to ask based on this trust thing. So we have trust, and we have social media, and we have HR policies. And when I think about, I was having a conversation with someone yesterday about like, how can we show up on social media? Because as soon as we get hired by a company, I'm going to be handcuffed in terms of my social media policy because I'm not going to be able to do anything. And so when I look at this from a trust perspective, like, how does this play throughout the process, right? If I'm a candidate, I want to have, and I'm an expert of some sort. I like to show that on my social media profile. I like to have my own personal brand. I also have friends who haven't been hired because they refuse to not maintain their own personal brand once they've been hired by a company. And the company's policy is that you can't do your own thing on social media. So those types of policies versus how we're using social media to like look for candidates. How do all of these things need to come together to actually create trust between a company and a candidate?
So I think there's a lot in there, but definitely I think is a valid question in terms of, what do you think? Because why recruit someone if you've seen they're so good at what they do, and then bring them in the door and muffle them? It just loses the value of that conversation. And so when I so going back to some of the social media legal training that I've done with organisations, where getting people to understand how you use social media effectively from a business perspective, but avoid the legal risk, because there is potential legal risk with reputational damage. You can spend 100 years creating a company and have it destroyed within 10 minutes of what goes out on a hashtag. So when we look at that, one of the things I look at organizations to think about is there's 3 layers that you need to consider when you are doing things. It's legal, is it ethical, and is it reasonable? If we look at legal, you've got to follow the law full stop in what is right, because to prevent certain people speaking, saying stuff, you can't do that unless it's a police state. We know that. Then you've got the next layer up, which is around the ethical. Is it the right thing? And again, you should be giving people guidance on how to use social media more effectively, not telling them no, but how. And I think this goes back to your point about there's some HR that fear because actually it's going to reduce their workload because, oh my God, someone's put that out there, someone's put it out there. Well, actually, is that HR's job? Well, no, maybe it's marketing's job because that's their specialism. Why should HR be the gatekeeper on everything? It shouldn't need to be. In the same way, actually, where does the manager come into this? That's my question. When should HR be the surrogate? We should be actually the individuals advising the managers on them actually doing their job properly. That's what we've got to think about here. But in the same light, that reasonable bit at the top, which I know is taken really from UK and Commonwealth-based law, but reasonable is if you ask any average individual in the street, is this right or wrong, and they give you an answer, that's what's deemed reasonable. So we've got to treat people like adults to make sure that we do things reasonably. And that they respect that it's a two-way thing in the contract. That's what a contract is. It's bipartite. If we pay you to do stuff, etc., you've also got to behave yourself. There's some implied terms there, and there's that trust. But we've also got into context, and I know this from my own background when I've been DV or developed vetted for the military and some of the work I've done with sensitive clients. There is stuff you can't put online. Adam has seen this previously. I went quiet for a couple of years purely because some of the work I was doing was in the security and policing space, and therefore you've got to be sensible and you've got to reason about what you do put out there, because you might therefore highlight different things. You might highlight individuals that might put other people at risk, and that's got to be careful. And because there is a tool out there called in the intelligence world called aggregation, where if you can pull lots of data from different sources, it's likely to point out, well, that is an indicator of this. So I had to be careful of all that. So I think you've got to be reasonable on both sides of the equation. It's not one side or the other. It's a non-binary scenario, and there has to be that open discussion. But to put your case in point, I had this exact problem in a previous organisation whereby the head of legal came to me and said, Giles, we need to support here. We need to have a social media policy. I said, right, okay. Why do we need a social media policy? I said, well, we need to control this, etc. I said, well, I get what you're going. That might be the baseline to start from to stop the certain behaviours we're seeing, but I'd argue we need to look at guidelines. Let's train people to use it. Let's give them the guidance and support and get managers to manage the people. That's what we should be doing, rather than with a backstop all the time in the firefighters, because all we'll ever be is for our firefighters. But what I did to put into context the conversation I said is that there will be those individuals that it doesn't matter what you do to try and help them, they're going to fall by the way. And I said, let's put it into legal context. I asked her, I said, so do we have laws in this country? And they said, of course we do. I'm a lawyer. I said, yeah, I get it. I said, do we have prisons? They said, well, yeah. I said, what does that tell you? It doesn't matter how many rules, policies you've got, you're still going to have a minority that break the rule. That's a reality. But we shouldn't create a policy to manage the minority. We should consider the majority, that most people are likely to follow the rules. And we have disciplinary scenarios. We have procedures around grievances, etc., that we can use disciplinary methods. All we'd have to do, we'd have to write multiple policies. If they are behaving incorrectly, we highlight that under the right point in the disciplinary process. Then that's what we should be looking at. But we should get people to say, look, we will treat you as adults, but if you act inappropriately, then we will deal with it. And let's treat people as adults. We're more likely to be so. Because there are punishments. If we look at prison, for example, prison isn't the only outcome. But if we look at the disciplinary process, if exit isn't the only outcome as well. You might get a written warning. You might get training, mediation. Just like with the police, for example, you might get a caution. You might get a fine. You don't have to go to prison. So I think this is where I use that as a context to say we have to look at the majority and use trust, that magic word, but also let people know and communicate them. This is on your watch as well. You've got to be careful about what you put out there, but we'll trust you. Let's work in a reasonable way to make that work together.
So last week we had Dr. Grant Van Ulrich on, and he spoke about the fact that when individuals go through change, often as part of a corporate change, but also in their lives as well, the expectation from a corporate perspective is, right, we're walking this way. And then off the organization goes, and you're coming with us because you're part of the organization. And he said, but surely, how many of you have ever been trained on how to embrace change? Of course, nobody put their hand up, okay, because it just doesn't happen. It never happens. So you can accept change or you can reject change. And this idea that you're an individual, the ramifications for that in this space can be quite profound, but also the fact that as an organization, you assume everybody is going to behave a certain way and go a certain way, and the reality is they don't, and that's why many transformations fail. But as a leader of an organization, many times leaders are stuck in the old world, this idea that I'm going to tell you what to do and then you're going to go away and execute that. And actually that may have worked last millennium, but it certainly doesn't work today. So how do we re-educate those people at the top of organizations that think that how you're going to behave on social, how you're going to present yourself, how you are going to represent this organization, that's an instruction that I'm going to give, and you will follow this to the letter. How do we educate them? Because this is a top-down problem, isn't it?
It is, and I think this is where, number one, they need to be open to training on how to use social media effectively. That's where we can use tools like reverse mentoring, whereby those who might be more youthful in the organisation, who have that exposure, the other generations, they may well have, and we can use that as a way of connecting the dots, because actually the leaders then start to see through that relationship there are other ways of thinking other than their own. And there's that exchange of ideas without a doubt. That's really useful. And we are working in a multi-generational workforce now. We've got 4 layers of generations. We're probably going to 5 shortly. But that isn't anything new, I'd argue, because before the industrial era, you probably had 4 generations, if they lived that long, all working on the same agrarian farm or farmstead, etc. So that's nothing really new, but it's going back to some of what we know. I think going back to what you said, this idea about change and the way to do it, everyone focuses, and I use the 3T model as a way of doing it. I like my 3s because it's easy to remember.
I was going to say you're into your
yeah,
T's
exactly. I
and
like
your
the 3s.
F's and your G's.
Because people remember them. And this goes back to my military background in terms of keep it simple, stupid. If you give people, right, just remember these 3, they go, they've got it, click, it goes. But when we talk about change, everyone wants transformational change. It's the rebranding of the word change, which everyone's going to be already fed up with, and they're going to go back to change. Because why? Humans are cyclic. But we look at that, we've got transformation. But transformation is usually the biggest change, the hardest change. It may pivot the entire organization, change what you do completely. That's why it's called transformational. But it doesn't happen overnight. It's not quick. It takes time to build, and it builds from the bottom up. It doesn't build necessarily from the top down. And in the same light, because you've got to bring people on the journey, a lot of people feel stuck at the other end of change, which is transactional, which is where they're only doing those little bits on a day-to-day basis, which don't necessarily align with the organization's going, but they're just doing let's see what's on my desk and move on that day. The real sweet spot for us, which is what I work with HR professionals on, especially in business partnering, is called transitional. That's the bit we need to focus on. We use mindsets like nudge. How do we create sustainable change? One of the best ways to do it is things like a pilot. If you do a pilot scheme, do pilot. People feel it's a safe space to do things. And then you do another pilot on top of another pilot. Before you know it, you're nudging people gently on that journey. And going back to that in terms of the 3 T's, that transformational thing, I was going to say something as an example of that. It'll probably come back to me shortly.
You're at that age again, aren't you?
Yeah. Do you know what? It's just it's the end of the week as well, so I'm looking forward to my retirement cottage. No, I'm joking. The point here is that when we look at those 3 levels, we focus often too much on the transformation. That was it. Transition. Give you an example of where that proves my point. Well, we all remember the delightful period called COVID, and there was a period then where everyone went, do you know what? We turned our organisations, we transformed. What would be 10 years in 10 days. No, you didn't. That's a reality. What you did is you gave people laptops and said, good luck. And they went home, and it actually took 10 months for people to adjust to. How do I use Teams? How do I connect with people? What system do I have access to? How do we have a conversation? How can we work virtually? It took 10 months to adjust those capabilities so people feel confident, capable of what they're doing. That's transition, which then does transform. And that's the missing trick I think we're doing. And so going back to those points about leaders, I think there are opportunities to get leaders to engage with other parts of the organization. Roundtables was something I use as a business partner in a previous organization to connect the dots between this is what leadership want. Okay, well then let's get the roundtable of different people from parts of the organization to go, what are your thoughts? How do you bounce it? There are lots of tools out there in order to create the change, whether you use Kotter's 8 stages, whether you use Lewin, etc. Those frameworks are there. We can use them. That's what they are, frameworks, because we're not humans. We're not machines. We don't just follow the boxes. I think there are lots of frameworks and opportunities for us to use these kind of frameworks to help people transition, because that is a sweet spot. But it does need a vision. It needs people to understand it. And going back to, I'm going to give you 3 C's now. If we start to get people to think about change, the 3 C's they've got to look at here is having commitment. Are they willing to? Nothing happens without the willingness.
And this is the individuals.
Yeah, this is individuals. So this is about commitment. So, you can have the best person doing their job, but unless they're committed, they're not going to do it the best way. And so you've got that commitment as a baseline. Then you've got capability. Are people able to adapt and change? And therefore that capability, we can train people, but we've got to give them time to do so and how we do that. And the fundamental bit at the top, which we forget when it comes to transformation, is capacity. It's the apex, because there's a limit. Because there are some people go, do you know what? I'm willing to change up to that point, but forget it beyond that point. That's me. I'm out of here. Or there's others that go, yeah, we change, but what we're focusing on is we need to change by this time. And that's the massive problem with change programs, in my view, is that they focus on the end date, not the end state. And I think we miss a trick there because, again, we are humans. Different people change at different times. And if we take into account that very simple pyramid to start having those conversations at a basic level, we start to feed that conversation up to hopefully get the right answer.
Wow.
What was the 3rd C again?
Third C, capacity.
Capacity. Thank you.
Yeah.
See,
And it's all underpinned by a magic word in every organisation called culture.
That's 4 C's, though, isn't it?
Yeah.
It is, but it's the 3 C's for the individual, but the culture is the organisation, Tim. I'll just pull that in there.
Yeah.
So Giles,
love.
I wanted to pick up on one of your first set of 3s. The 3 P's that you talked about: pervasive professional profile. I've done quite a bit of recruiting myself for salespeople for tech companies. And honestly, in my experience, pervasive professional profiles, there's a real low bar out there in terms of what you're up against in the terms of the competition. But I wanted to get your take on what you think of as pervasive, first and foremost. Should my Facebook account look like my Twitter account, look like my Facebook, look like my LinkedIn account and Instagram? Or am I allowed to be, for lack of a better term, different people on different platforms?
So I think that's a very good question. And there, again, there isn't a binary answer to this. And it will come down to the nature of the organization. But so, for instance, if you work in a US perspective, if you work for the US DoD or other particular ones which may be related to Homeland Security, they will take into account what your opinions, your thoughts and ideas are, because there's a potential risk, without a doubt, which we've seen in recent cases in the US with individuals being taken to court for different things. So I think you've got to, again, this is about reasonable, about, you take a risk with anything you put out there, which we all know as professionals. Personally, and this is my personal belief, is that different platforms can be used for different ways and for different reasons. And you can be different personalities on those. I might use one platform for one thing. So Facebook, for example, is used for my friends and my family. That's it. But because that's what I see it as. Yes, there is a professional element to it, and I'm mindful of how I communicate for that very same reason. But that's what I use for that. Whereas LinkedIn is very much my professional. I don't put anything about personal because that's just the way I operate. That's the way I, to some extent, not really, I balance rather than simply blend. A lot of people will blend their message out there. So I think if people want to be pervasive, it is, but it's having a consistent message that you want a professional to pick up on. And that's the bit to remember, because if you want another professional to pick up and say that consistent, okay, we see them on these different platforms acting this way, we can do that. And the classic example is, you might have a Facebook profile on one thing which is about you, and you've got privacy options. Without a doubt, you can close down privacy options. A nice way to control what people see and how they can access. But in the same light, having that basic profile, if you're consistent in your behavior, the way you do things across Twitter, LinkedIn, etc., that's great. But also, it's not stopping you having multiple Twitter profiles. You might have one that is personal, which is I can be X and I can be an anonymous character, or I can be this individual professionally. So I don't think there's one single answer to that. I think you've got to be mindful of what is the environment you're operating in, who are the kind of clients or people you're working with. You've got to consider the different platforms and the way you want to come across, which is a personal choice. There's the magic two words there are human agency. You make a choice. There isn't necessarily an answer. You've got to consider your own perspectives. But you've also then considered what is your brand out there if it is taken. Because once you've released it into the social space, you have no control over it. Even with privacy settings, if someone has a tag, etc., they can share it otherwise. And we all know there's got screen captures, etc. So I think building a pervasive profile, if you want to do it professionally, is being mindful of how many platforms you use and what you put out there. You can still be yourself, but be careful how you communicate. That goes back to that netiquette mindset. But I think you've also got to be mindful about if you're operating a certain environment, you've got to there's a risk to it.
So I've got a question about, sorry, Tracy, I can see your lips moving. I guess you're on mute.
I was totally on mute, but you go first, Alex.
Well, I'm changing the subject slightly, so I don't know if your point is related to what Giles was just talking about. If it is, go.
I was just gonna say, from the personal perspective, I'm a fan of looking at your profile as if it's a mirror of you. And so my Facebook profile is more for my personal friends, and I do mom stuff and things on there, but I'm still proud of what I see on there. If an employer looked at it, what they would see is that I'm a mom, and if you don't like that, then I'm probably not gonna like working for you. Anyways, my LinkedIn profile looks a little bit different. Well, I'm very active on my LinkedIn profile. I talk about more business types of things. My Instagram profile, I'm not a huge fan of Instagram, so it's just it exists so that people can tag me on podcasts and stuff that I am on. But the podcasts that I'm on are a good reflection of me. So I'm just a fan of looking at it from that perspective. Do you feel like it's a good representation of you, even if the representations aren't exactly the same? Because I think then your personal brand consistency is good, but maybe the messaging and number of posts and things like that aren't exactly the same.
Again, it's a blend, and it goes back to what do you think is reasonable, what do you think is sensible, what portrays you. But also have to be honest. If we look at social media and the way people use it, you very rarely get people post stuff. A lot of people use social media as a way to say that the world's really bright around me. I need to compete. Everyone else is saying it's great, I'm great, etc. And I worry about some of the effects that it may have on people's psychology longer term. This goes back to this digital well-being piece. We know that from things like FOMO, fear of missing out, that people, oh no, I'm not part of it. And I know when I've looked, and I discussed it with Adam briefly in terms of threads. If you're an Instagram user, I looked in with, I'll have a look at threads, but it said you have to have an Instagram account. Well, I don't have an Instagram account. I don't use it. I don't have the time, put it bluntly. Even though I think it's an interesting tool, it has some great uses, I don't have the time. So that's me, right? Threads is out. And it's interesting that the CIPD, who I work with as both an associate and as a lead for business partnering in partnership, and I think they're amazing the way they think. they have set up there, but they've rightly said, you have to be mindful of privacy risks and all that kind of stuff around it. There are risks with it. But if you can't use it, and you don't have the time, then what's the point? So I think going back to some of the points you raised there, you've got to be mindful about what is it you want to put out there. Be careful what it is you put out there. So it's whatever you're comfortable with. But always remember, and we see this with trolling on any of the social media platforms, there'll always be someone that twists something. And I think you've got to be very careful of that, is that you might say something and well, you said this. No, I didn't. It's just you've taken it like that. And that's where it becomes problematic. And I think also that the point you make about when you're putting stuff out there about you, what you want to portray, because we do sometimes want to put a positive image out there about what we're doing, how we're doing, especially in the sales environment, when it was like me as a freelancer, you want to say, this is the good work I thoroughly enjoy and that I'm doing. You've also got to remember that are people polishing it? And that goes back to, let's go full circle now here, that goes back to trust. So can you trust everything that people put out there?
Yeah, it's interesting. I wanted to ask you a question specifically about ethics, the use of AI, but not necessarily on social media. Although we could maybe talk about that as well. But where employees are starting to use AI, not just to help them do their job better, but do their work for them. And do you see this as a problem? Have we gone beyond that now, or do you see this as a problem where people could be hired to do a job and it's not actually them and their skills doing the job, it's the AI doing it for them? Is that a problem even?
Maybe, but again, that depends on the bigger point about performance. How do you measure performance? And if someone is working smart but not hard, and they can use their brain for other things, because if they've automated some of their processes and work that's taken the meaningful side out, good luck to them. If they can use their brain to be more creative, innovative, share with other people, build a better brand for the organization, which all the stuff they couldn't do, then isn't that a positive? So I think that there's that side of it to consider. Without a doubt, there are people, that might use tools to do that, not do their work, and then sit back and do nothing. But with all due respect, they're the ones that companies worried about when they said, they're going to spend all their time on Facebook, or they're going to get you and spend 2 hours on a cigarette break. It's those same behaviors. So it's the behaviors we need to look for there. But I have no issue. So, AI, there's this big fear that, it's going to take on everyone's jobs, etc., and take over this, that, and the other. And yes, that can be one extreme. But there are other things in between there. There is no one single future. There are multiple different ones. And I'm a strong believer that AI a machine should complement what we do. I mean, if you look at some of the, if you look at Digital Human by Dave Copland, who used to be the Chief Innovation Officer for Microsoft, brilliant book that looks at exactly that. The idea being we should actually work with machines going forward, because that's where the benefits are. So there'll be AI that can help us, and we can help the AI, and it can work in tandem to make things better and actually create better work and working lives as a result. So I think there's an opportunity. And that means AI doesn't have to be this binary situation, whether it's with AI or it is without. My thing here is I'm a strong believer in not just AI, it should be IA. And that goes back to using AI. IA is intelligence augmented. That's what we should be doing. It's not just the AI, it's intelligence augmented. How are we using technology and machines to create better work, to do better work, to be more innovative, to create communities of practice, to create better ways of communicating globally. And this is why some of the future HR skills I think about, virtual workforce management, creating communities that learn from one another inherently and adaptively through these technologies. So I think there's more value to be had with AI currently in that narrow AI status than there is as a fear. But again, we can't blame the technology. It's people who use the technology and how they use it. Just like with social media and trolling and inappropriate behavior, and just like with the AI, how they'll use it. You can't blame the technology for human agency. People make a choice.
Do you know? I've heard someone's actually using this thing called a spreadsheet. They should be using a calculator and adding it up on an abacus.
How about one of those?
Why are people allowed to use Excel spreadsheets?
Yeah.
So at the very beginning, you said about how the tools that we use to identify people that should come in for interviews, sometimes those can have prejudices or are built in the image of the people that have created them. So really interesting question here from Donald. how do you bring that balance? You know, how do you make sure that someone who is different from you, you know, different gender, different ethnicity, different religious background, how do you keep that balance in place? Because there may be cultural or linguistic differences between them and you, which may fall foul of some of your initial selection processes. And I mean, I think one of the things that all of us would acknowledge very openly is that when you have more balance in a group of people, it's more effective, because otherwise you end up in an echo chamber where everyone's just nodding and agreeing with what, and you never move forward like that. So how do you do that? How do you do that when you're recruiting? How do you keep that appropriate balance?
And I don't think, if I had the answer, I would be an absolute billionaire. There'd be no doubt about it. You know, and that's the problem, I think, is that going back to Donald's very, very good question. You know, for a start, you're asking an almost middle-aged white male, which is a great opportunity there, you know, to tick that box. But I think, you know, what we have to think about here is that the word that I think that Donald used really well is nuance. It's how you use it and to what extent. And I think it's taking into account all those different things that matter. And, you know, it's like saying, it's like using the word African, for example. African is not one single thing. You've got Sub-Saharan, you've got West Africa, East Africa, different cultures, tribal mindsets, you know, everything, animist beliefs versus Muslim versus, you know, there's no, unfortunately, as humans, we like to box things. When it comes to diversity and inclusion, EDI, whatever you want to call it, my biggest issue is we get people to tick a box. Actually, if we talk about EDI, there shouldn't even be a box. It's about the different blends and stuff that we have in terms of that thinking. And I think that's where we sometimes get it wrong. So I think what we need to do, there was a, what's her name? Hannah Fry. I love Hannah Fry. She's my professional crush, to put it bluntly. And she had me when she said the quote, she was intellectually promiscuous. Oh, I love that. But she's a very good speaker and an authority globally, I think, on AI. And she highlighted all these risks around AI and highlighted in the US system, for example, that they applied AI as a judge in a court, and it murdered people. Quite simply that, you know, in terms of there was no nuance of balances in terms of people's backgrounds, other things that might have indicated their behaviors. It was it was almost like an expert system, right? You didn't do that, didn't that? That's it, death. And they highlighted that we still need this human overview. So I think with the AI that we're using, we've got to be careful that, yes, we're mindful of who builds the AI and what the frameworks they build within it. We need to stress test them. We need to have the other parties part of it. But also we need that ethical element above it, which we are getting, you know, in terms of people making decisions based on the AI on other things, so we can balance it. And that's where I think that human nuance comes into it. I don't think we've got it right, because not every human is perfect, because we're not. And everyone on this call comes from a different background, different way of thinking. We are all wired differently. And I think we take into account that and we try and minimize the risk, but we'll try and mitigate it. But I don't think we'll ever get rid of it, because even as we go now, if you look at things like, for instance, the LGBTQ+ or any other way you want to put it in there, these are different groups of people that we've pulled together as a community. But sometimes even they are very different in their mindsets and disagree. So I think we have to be careful by putting in some safeguards, and I don't mean safeguards in terms of policies, but practices that we should use. So, for instance, make sure we stress test who's building these technologies, under what guidance, what parameters, and what kind of ethical scenarios are we putting in there. In the same light, when we use the data, make decisions, as we do even today with things like, if you look at GDPR and use of data, you can't make a decision so the data says X. You have to have a conversation with someone to assess that data and then make a human assessment. The data informs you, it provides insight, it doesn't tell you the answer. And I think if we build those ethical systems in place by using humans, that again gets that balance I was talking about, intelligence augmented, how we create technology and talent to get better solutions. So hopefully that goes somewhere of answering it, but I don't have the answer, because if I did, I'd be absolutely stacked with cash.
Okay, so
but doesn't this come down to culture at the end of the day? Because like, either as a culture of the business, you're going to decide, like, you're going to choose that, yes, we can use this data, but we want the human nuance. We care about diversity and belonging. And so we're going to look for those things. We're going to hire for those things. So, like, this isn't, to me, this is where the hybrid is breaking between humans and technology, is that humans create the culture, and if the culture matches, then we can do those things. But if the culture doesn't match, it's not as simple as being like, okay, let's put a DEI or DEIB or EDI policy in place, right? Like the culture has to match. Is that true, Giles?
I think it is, again, to some extent. But if we look at that and some of the organizations out there recently that have tried the same thing and then been destroyed in terms of their commercials and the way they've done things, if we look at things like Bud Light, if we look at scenarios currently with Ben & Jerry's about the backlash in terms of some of their communications, where some of the thoughts and ideas might be genuinely progressive, but this is the way it's done. And again, I think we've got, it's a complete balancing act in terms of what leadership culture that's created, the culture of the people around them, because leaders might talk the talk, but do they walk the walk? There's a massive thing there. They do like this, talk about things, I am this, but behind the closed doors, no, they're not. And that's just propaganda, not practice. And so therefore, but also you've got to have a business that's viable. So you've got to take, you can preach certain things or do certain things, but unless you practice them, believe in them, and they integrate with the wider society, not just the culture of your organization, but culture outside, that's something to consider, because otherwise you can grow your socials, but you may not be on your viables in terms of your financials, and that becomes problematic. So it's a massive balancing act in today's world. And that's where social media, again, can be a make or break or a fantastic force multiplier in terms of your business opportunity.
So here's a great question we've had from Rob, and we sometimes joke about this. You've got a marketing director, they've done a dreadful job, you fire them, and then you need to hire a replacement, and you use the same job spec and description to hire the replacement. Surprisingly, you get somebody that's exactly the same as the person you've just hired.
Shocker.
Yeah. So this is a big issue, though, isn't it? This is a big issue that you talk about boxing things in. It's like, we need somebody that ticks all of these different boxes, and that's what we're hiring for, even though that's the last thing in reality that we need.
So there are a couple of things here that I was, when I'm working with HR to get them to think about, or recruiters to advise them. Firstly, stop thinking about the now, think about 2 years down the line. You should be recruiting not for now, but 2 years down the line. Why? Because once you get someone on board, they then have to go through a probation period, they have to go through their first appraisals, blah, blah, blah. And so you're only getting up to sort of the norming, performing environment, maybe 9 to 12 months down the line, where they feel comfortable, they're in, they know what they're doing, how they're doing, they're connected to the organization. And then you look at out 12 months, what do you need to achieve by? So that's the first thing, is we don't do that. So of course, the job spec will have to change, because in 2 years, every job will probably change because of the different nuances. So that's the first point. Second one is you're spot on. Why are we going back to the same thing all the time? One of the things that I think we should be doing, and one of the things that I've done in interview, is said, this is what we think things look like, and this is our perfect person. If I gave you this job, what would you do differently? This is what we've done in the past. What would you do differently? Because that's when you spot talent, because they'll think outside the box. They'll look for innovative ways of doing things and go, well, I disagree with that, and it might do that. Okay, let's talk about it more. I've been really energized by some of the conversations as a result, and then go, right, this person, you do need to speak to the exec next, etc., because we get a different way of thinking, because that's what you want. And that then is supported by the right processes behind it that bring that to light. And sometimes, every employer puts out there that the 100% spec that they're looking for. The reality is, you're never going to get it. So you've got to have that honest conversation. What is your comfortable fit? Do you want 60-40, 80-20, 70-30? And what are
you're never going to get it. Yeah, you're never going to get it. But actually, maybe you don't want it anyway.
Because you got it wrong in the first place.
Exactly. And the people that are setting the job, if I'm hiring somebody as head of marketing, it would be reasonable to assume that the head of marketing would know more about marketing than I do, because they're going to be the head of marketing.
See, but that goes back to, so why ask HR to write the spec? It always needs to be HR, go write the job spec. I always push back and say, this is your job, this is your people, I'll work with you. You write what you think, and then I'll build in nuances and make sure you're not discriminating and help you do so, because then I'll advise you, because that's the value add. Because you know your people, you know what you're looking for. I'll advise you and help you and put the nuances, and these are language, these are kind of things that can be picked up on a search. And that's the value add I see.
I like to tell my clients
about marketing jobs all the time, because I am like, oh, are you like super happy with how your marketing is performing? Because that's the only scenario which it makes sense to hire somebody to do exactly what the last person did.
So we are absolutely approaching time now. So thank you to everybody on the panel. particularly Giles, our guest today.
Well done, Giles.
Thank you to everybody on the audience.
Hope to see you in 2 years' time.
This has been the digital download, which is, Rob?
What is it now?
The longest
The
running.
longest running.
Weekly
So you
business
do
talk
know.
show on
I think
LinkedIn.
memory's everywhere now, isn't it? But thank you very much, everyone. I really
Thanks,
appreciate
Giles.
being invited. Thank you.
Thank you. And see you all next week. Bye-bye.